Yeah,
Cool.
great. So we've heard some really interesting stuff about all the different impacts that climate change is having and the mechanisms causing it. The work in our lab focuses on how climate change is affecting forests, subalpine forests, and how fire can act as a catalyst to initiate environmental change. So the question I'm going to focus on is how abiotic variation controls tree regeneration in subalpine forests, and whether abiotic variation creates refugia for tree regeneration or actually amplifies the vulnerability of seedlings to climate change. I want to really quickly acknowledge our funders, NSF, and the University of Wisconsin, and feel free to follow me on Twitter. So, the domain of this work is the Greater Yellowstone, which is this large protected area in the northwest corner of Wyoming that many of you are probably familiar with. It's anchored by Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks. It's really well known for its wildlife and for its geothermal activity, but it's also a really interesting system to study because it's coexisted with high severity infrequent fire for millennia. So unlike systems like the Southwest, where we have low severity fire that doesn't kill trees and just kind of skunks around in the underbrush, in Yellowstone and in the northern Rockies we have high severity fire that fires that are really large, that killed most of the trees in an area and happen every 100 to 300 years. So this system is well adapted. Jennifer mentioned some of those traits that allow a system like this to coexist with fire. However, fire is increasing across the West. So the extent of fires, the severity of fires, and the frequency of fires is all increasing. And that's raising some concern about systems that were historically resilient to fire, how they might change, particularly with increasing frequency of fire, and how those changes in disturbance activity might be compounded by other anthropogenic drivers of change, like drought and land use change. So we're interested in trying to figure out how these compounding effects might manifest in an ecosystem state transition, where together we have a transition from a historically forested system to a non-forested grassland or shrubland system. So in Yellowstone, when we're thinking about the controls of post-fire regeneration, two main things have come out of the literature as kind of the key drivers. The first is seed availability. So there's a lot of work going on to try to understand how changing fire activity is altering seed availability through the distance to seed source and other mechanisms. What I'm going to talk about today is another side of this, which is the abiotic template for regeneration. So if we do have seed, and we do have plenty of seed making it to a site, how does the kind of intense post-fire environment that you can see here, how does that control and mediate germination? So it's important to keep in mind that this is a critical window for maintaining an ecosystem, this post-fire window, because seeds are really vulnerable to environmental conditions. Often when we think about the kind of species distribution, we're talking about adults, but juveniles actually have this much narrower range of environmental variation in which they can exist. So it's not hard to imagine when you look at little seedlings, or you think about a plant in your garden when you first put it out in the summer, they're really vulnerable. And so this is a really important window to understand. So we used an experiment to ask how topographic position mediates post-fire seedling establishment. And our hypothesis was that establishment will be reduced in topographic positions that are vulnerable to drying. So low elevations and south-facing sites that receive more solar radiation are going to be vulnerable to drying and will probably have lower establishment and survival. And then we also wanted to know how lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, the two dominant conifer species in the Greater Yellowstone, how they differ in their responses to abiotic variation. And we hypothesized that the establishment of Douglas fir will be greater than lodgepole pine in these more vulnerable topographic positions. And I'll just mention that this is an inland Douglas fir subspecies which occurs in a kind of a lower montane hotter and drier setting, very unlike the Douglas fir that we're surrounded by here. So bringing it back to our study system, the Greater Yellowstone. This is a map of the Greater Yellowstone. The black lines indicate Yellowstone National Park and Grand Teton National Park. And all these red polygons are fires that have occurred over the observed record over the last 50 years. And all this light pink, most of that fire activity occurred in one big fire year in 1988, which you might be familiar with. Burned about 80% of the forested area of Yellowstone, and there's been a lot of work to understand the recovery of those forests since. These darker red are areas that burned in 2016, which was the largest fire year in the area since 1988. And it's a really interesting moment for us to study because that was a 28-year return interval between those fires, which is very, very short relative to that 100 to 300-year return interval that these systems have evolved with. So we focused on a few specific fires. The first is the maple fire here in West Yellowstone. Here are some images to just give you a sense of what that post-fire landscape looks like. It was a high severity fire, large patches, really high mortality. We looked at this is by the way, a lodgepole pine dominated site. We looked at the buffalo fire, which is in the northeast corner of the park. It's in this lower Douglas fir montane forest. It's much drier than the other fires. The fire severity was a little bit different. We have these remnant trees, and we have some unburned trees, particularly on our north-facing site. And then we have the berry fire, which reburned the 2000 Glade fire, and so that's a 16-year fire return interval, and the berry Huck, the Huck fire of 1988, where the berry fire reburned that area. And you can see this is similar to our maple fire setting, where it was a lodgepole pine dominated and really high severity large patches. So we set up this experiment where we put in plots on north-facing, south-facing, and flat aspects. You can kind of see how a schematic here of how you can imagine that laying out on the landscape. And then within each of these sites, we put in 15 frames. And then in 5 of those frames, we planted 50 Douglas fir seeds. In 5 of them, we planted 50 lodgepole pine seeds. And in 5 of them, we didn't plant any seeds, so we could get a sense of how much natural regeneration there was. And spoiler, there was none. So we don't have to worry about that. All the germination that we saw was the seeds that we planted. Then we installed soil temperature and soil moisture sensors. This is kind of what that setup looks like. They're buried 5 centimeters below the surface. And then we collected this data continuously over the last year. We also installed above ground meteorology data and collected that continuously as well. These are some meter all-in-one stations. And then we measured the seedlings' height and basal diameter every 2 weeks over the course of the summer. And then we went back just a couple weeks ago in October and measured them again. So the data that I'm showing are really preliminary. We just collected the last set of data a couple weeks ago. So I'm going to show you kind of the initial patterns and what's going on, and then I'll welcome your feedback on some good quantitative ways to move forward with that. So I'm going to walk you through just the first panel here before we get into all of the sites. So again, here's the Berry Glade site. We're looking at, on the x-axis, we're looking at time. So each of these points is one of those biweekly sampling periods. On the y-axis, we're looking at, on the left side here, you can see the count of seedlings that we found in each of these aspects the day that we went out and sampled. And then on the right side, I just have converted that to a percentage. So you can, whatever makes more sense to you, to think about the number of seedlings or the percent of possible seedlings that could have been out there of what we planted. So nod your head if that makes sense. Great. So we can see a few key things here. The first is these initial values. So this is kind of a, it's not exactly germination because there was some germination that happened after the first sampling event, but this first period kind of shows you the general variation, kind of these relative differences by aspect that we saw. And in the final values here, that's of course going to reflect the survival over the growing season. And then I want to highlight this pattern by aspect. So remember, the hypothesis was that we would have reduced germination at south-facing aspects, and that was the case. And we saw that across all of our sites pretty consistently. So we're looking at lodgepole pine in the upper panel here, and Douglas fir in the lower panel, and we see that we have similar patterns by aspect in both of those species. But to dig into that a little bit more, here we're looking at the total number of seeds germinated. So not just the first sampling, but the total number of seeds that germinated throughout the summer. You can see that there is this variation by aspect that I've already highlighted. There is lower germination in Douglas fir, which we expect they just naturally regenerate or naturally germinate at a lower rate. But interestingly, if we look at the proportion of these seeds that survived the whole summer, in the lodgepole pine, the south-facing aspect had higher mortality, but the mortality was the same in the flat and the north-facing sites. Whereas in the Douglas fir, the mortality then also varied by aspect. So that doesn't really match with our hypothesis. It seems like the Douglas fir might actually be more sensitive to aspect than we thought, and more sensitive than the lodgepole pine. So now I want to turn to some of the environmental data that we collected. So this is soil moisture over the course of the summer. You can see that it basically draws down continuously over the summer, but that's interrupted by these rain events. But it never gets back to that spring soil moisture at any point during the summer. Temperature is a more variable pattern, but again, getting these peak temperatures in August. The big thing that I want to highlight with the environmental data here at this point is these really, really high temperatures that we're seeing in the middle of the summer. This confidence, or this band here represents the minimum and maximum values. So we have weeks of the summer where we have more than 40 degrees soil temperature. That's like 105 degrees. That's really, really warm. And so you saw how small those seedlings are. It's really incredible that they're surviving at all out there. And then the final thing I want to note is the difference between the soil temperature and the air temperature. So here I'm showing just the difference between soil and air temperature. And we're finding that across these sites and in north and south facing aspects, we have consistently soil temperatures that are 5 to 10 degrees warmer than air temperatures. So the implication of this is that if we're using air temperatures to kind of approximate soil temperatures and think about how ecosystems are going to manage in the future, we're going to be underestimating what they're actually experiencing. So topography does mediate seedling establishment. South-facing sites are more vulnerable. Douglas fir germinates at a lower rate and may be just as vulnerable to aspect effects as other species, or maybe even more. And this relationship between soil temperature and air temperature might allow us to extrapolate soil conditions using meteorological data. I'll take any questions. Sure.
So your hypothesis was that under drying conditions you would have more vulnerability to.
Right.
Okay, and then is it the south-facing slopes
are this orange yellow?
Okay, so you match your hypothesis that the drier ones were.
Basically, yes. Although what maybe you're noticing here is that they're not always drier.
Yeah, that's what I was. Yeah.
And so ultimately what we want to do is, right now we're kind of using aspect as sort of a proxy for the environmental conditions. And then ultimately what I hope to do in a kind of a modeling framework is use the actual environmental data. So whether or not it was at a north-facing site or a south-facing site, we want to predict, mortality or survival as a function of that actual environmental data instead of this kind of surrogate that we're using for aspect. But you do pretty much get the pattern that you would expect with south-facing sites being hotter and drier. But that does vary from site to site. Yeah. Yeah.
Do they know what causes a lot of the big fires in Yellowstone would be such high severity?
Well, that's just kind of how that forest is. The lodgepole pine grows really densely. It has what we call ladder fuels, so it has fuels all the way down to the ground. It's really flammable, so it just naturally burns at high severity. And that the fire activity is really driven by climate. So unlike some systems that tend to be driven by fuel availability, in the northern Rockies, and in the Northwest for that matter, there's always enough fuel. It's more a matter of, is it hot enough and dry enough to dry that fuel out and to promote fire activity?
So on one of the first slides where you were saying it could result in a transition to a different type of forest or grassland,
Yeah.
if that happens, do you think that could then go back and affect the fire severity or lower the fire severity?
Definitely, yeah. There would be a negative feedback there where we could actually see a fuel limitation in these systems where we've never seen a fuel limitation before. I mean, that's a pretty far extreme, but I think that was alluded to in Heidi's talk, where ultimately if we have this kind of runaway increase in fire activity, at some point we're going to burn up the fuel. And so there will be a negative feedback there. And that's an open question, not just in terms of consuming all the forest, but like in the boreal forest, there's a potential to transition to less flammable, deciduous dominated forests. And that could maybe happen with aspen in the GYE as well. So, yeah.